Jimmy in San Antonio, who I think has a relevant topic here. Hey, Jimmy, can you hear us?
What's up, Jimmy?
Yeah, I can hear you guys.
What's up, Jimmy?
Oh, no, I heard. Hey, what's up,
Hey.
Dan? Hey, what's up, Ocean?
Yeah.
I just wanted to introduce maybe you guys to a topic or a certain interpretation of found in Christian mysticism of the Trinity.
Okay.
The Trinity was developed later by mystics who wanted to understand the nature of God, or the nature of what they referred to as the Father, but not the Father as a paternalistic being, as in, Michelangelo's painting of the old man, the long white beard. It was more used in the sense of how Plotinus referred to the One. It was a term to refer to what's known as the absolute in philosophy. And so in the mystical interpretation, the Son is the man or woman that is the conduit that receives insight into the Father by means of the Holy Spirit, or even what neuroscientists today are calling mystical experience. It's a phenomenon in consciousness, and at least that's the interpretation in our modern neuroscience. And so I guess I'm just really calling to ask if you guys have ever came across that interpretation in Christian mysticism.
This sounds like Arianism a little bit. Do you believe that that Christ was like, did the Father beget Christ? Is that what you're?
Well, if you recall, I think it's John 10, chapter 30, Christ is saying, "I and Father are one," and
Right.
So to have the Holy Spirit is to have a direct experience of the Father. Or the way they would phrase it is they would call it a dissolution into the absolute, or a merging. So that's why you have this phrasing, "I and the Father are one," because it's considered kind of a merging.
If Jesus and the Father are one, and Jesus prayed to the Father, what was happening?
Well, in Christian mysticism, original prayer is contemplation. So it's a direct experience with you could say a philosophical absolute.
Mm-hmm.
So
what you're wind up looking at here, this is turning into modalism. Now, Jesus isn't actually praying to the Father, so the Father and Jesus are not separate entities. Yeah, you've that little graph that you have. Now that Jesus praying to the Father is just contemplation. Jesus is the Father. You don't have an is not between the Son and the Father. You're just looking at this as a true monotheism thing, and you're labeling his different actions as one thing or another, which winds up kind of like becoming modalist. So, I mean, and there's a thing that I'll put forward is that modalism is a heresy, but it's also coherent. If a Christian wants to put forward an idea that they're just going to be heretical and call it a day, then fine. I don't have much of an issue with that. But you're not defending the doctrine of the Trinity anymore. You're defending a heresy.
Well, I mean, there is modern science to back up, this stuff, and I don't know if you're familiar with it at all, but I am referring to an interpretation in that can be found in Christian mysticism, and it's not. I don't think it's exclusive to Christianity. I think the way it's expressed, especially in the research, is that all religions express a word to describe that experience. There's a very similar concept in Hinduism that you could compare to.
Are you suggesting that Hindus are actually Christians?
I'm suggesting that underlying core truth found in mysticism is universal to the major religions.
Right, so you're kind of you're approaching religion with sort of a perennialism, which is it's essentially a mass relabeling of all religions into a Christian definition, which now you're just trying to assert your version of a spiritual experience over everyone else's spiritual experience has ever experienced one. And it's an especially weird thing that Christians try and do, is to justify their monotheism by relabeling every other faith as Christian. And I don't get that approach. Like, why not relabel Christianity under a Hindu setting? Is there a reason not to do that?
But
I disagree.
I will add on to this because what you're talking about here, Ocean, is interesting because the Hindus that I've talked to, when they talk about Jesus, like at least what was described to me as Jesus was a spiritual master, and so like it goes both ways. Like there's the framing of Jesus under Hindu lenses. Like I think what we're kind of getting at here is are there experiences which you can find commonalities in that people would describe as religious experiences through mysticism? Yes, absolutely. I think that you can definitely compare and contrast. But
that's why you see mystics in a number of different traditions.
Yeah,
the thing that I have an issue with is saying that all mystics are Christian because they have mystical experiences.
Yes, and so like this was because this hits heavy with me because on the tail end of my Christianity, I identified as a Christian mystic because this was the lens I was using. I was doing the same thing. I was like, oh, I'm looking at the neuroscience that kind of Jimmy is talking about. It's like, oh, well, we're all having these experiences and stuff. There must be talking to maybe one universal consciousness or like that there's something out there beyond myself. But I did frame it under that Christian lens. I still did call myself a Christian mystic. Why I don't use that label anymore is because I realize
well, you're an atheist.
Well, I'm an atheist now, but there's that. But like part of it was because there wasn't. The same as kind of what you're saying, Ocean, is I didn't have a reason to call it Christian. Like those labels and stuff. I realized that was a result of my cultural understanding and the terminology that I just kind of used. But it wasn't really grounded on anything. It was just what I was used to. Now maybe Jimmy has reasons as to why we should think that they are specifically Christian. I don't know, but I'd be interested to hear.
I was going to argue against that because Ocean mentioned perennialism. If you're referring to the perennial philosophy, it doesn't have a bias towards Christianity. It's not even a religion in and of itself.
No, but your expression of it does.
Well, no, I don't have a version of it. I'm not saying that Christianity is the true mystic experience, and all religions are trying to emulate that. That's not what I'm saying at all.
That's what it sounded like you were saying. So if you're not saying that, and you're saying that, like are you a polytheist then? Are you recognizing that Hindus and other religions are actually following deities that are distinct from the Christian one?
No, I would consider myself an adherent to the perennial philosophy. I actually study the perennial philosophy very deeply.
All right, so you're a perennialist, but you're not holding the Christian. So you're just a monotheist that believes that there's, I don't know. You explained it in a very Christian way, which makes me think that you're holding a Christian bias in your perennialism.
No, I opened with that because I was watching the show throughout, and you guys mentioned it earlier. You said you couldn't find any sense in the Trinity, and I think there is a way that it does make sense, but I don't think it's exclusive.
Oh yeah, you described. So, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what if you look at what my video? You probably haven't seen it. What I do is I explain the different heresies of the Trinity in order to make it coherent. But all of those coherent constructs of the Trinity are heresies. They're not the doctrine of the Trinity. So if you're going to say, well, I can describe the Trinity in a way that is coherent, then I'm like, sure, yes, fine, but that's going to fit into one of these heresies. So, if you want to hold to a heresy in your interpretation of the Trinity, then call it a day. You're a heretic. But, you're agreeing with me at that point to say that the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity, is incoherent, but you can be a modalist. And what you described was essentially modalism.
I think it's coherent for mystics, and mystics were often considered, heretics.
Of course,
insights would go against religion or the popular religion of the time, of their time, or whatever time they lived in. Any theologian, if you look into early Christianity, a theologian is not understood how it is today. It's not a scholarship term. It's not. I don't mean a scholarship. I'm sorry. It's not a scholarly term. It was a term given to anyone, a practicing disciple who was who practiced these spiritual disciplines found in mysticism. And they were attempting to undergo directly the Holy Spirit, or what before the Holy Spirit they called theoria. These are the mystics' term for a direct experience of the absolute, direct experience of God. And I would say a lot. If the more deeply you go into early Christianity, the more you're going to find mysticism associated with it, all the way back to the original Roman Catholic.
One problem that I have is when you're describing, say, like the absolute, you're referencing Plato there, I assume, right? Plato and Aristotle.
Yes, it is a term in philosophy, but yes, Plato referred to it as the good, or Plotinus eventually called it the one.
Right, but that was the one that was described in the context of a polytheistic tradition. So, like, even under that, in order to hold that there's like only one deity, you would need to relabel Platonism or Aristotelian philosophy in order to actually get to where you're going. You need to change it in order to have that function. You're not using Aristotle or Plato. You're kidnapping their concepts and putting a Christian label on them and moving forward with it.
Well, I don't know why you're mentioning polytheism though, because
I'm a polytheist. That's what I do. I'm sorry.
No. Well, the reason I say that is because Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Plotinus, so forth, they actually criticize, the mainstream religion of the time of Zeus on his offspring. They didn't believe that. They criticized that.
Yes, they did. So here's something that you need to know. There is I want you to look up the will of Aristotle. He has statues built to Zeus, Demeter, and Athena. Upon his death, he funds those projects because of his devotion to those deities. Aristotle was a polytheist.
I would disagree. I believe Aristotle believed with Plotinus.
You disagree with Aristotle, then? You disagree with Aristotle's will?
No, I disagree that he was a polytheist. I believe their understanding of the divine was expressed in what culminated as what Plotinus would call the one. And it was understood as a philosophical absolute. I wouldn't call it polytheistic, though. I would say it's more maybe transtheism is a term that Paul used. And then,
my definition of a polytheist is somebody that believes in multiple gods. Aristotle funded this upon his death, funded statues to 3 deities that are in the Greek pantheon. That suggests to me that he was a polytheist. If you have some kind of counter evidence to say that Aristotle dismisses these deities, because I don't think that he ever once says that Zeus isn't real or anything like that. He talks about a prime mover, but he doesn't dismiss the deities.
Evidence. There's a reason why Plotinus called it the one and not the ones.
Actually, hold on a second. Well.
Well,
I'll pull up another source for you real quick. I'm going to read something from.
Let's try to wrap it up in just a few minutes here, just so because I can't arbitrate on this topic too much because we're definitely going outside of my field of expertise. But we do have other people who want to talk about some other interesting topics as well. But it is an interesting discussion. I'll be honest, I've never heard Aristotle described as a polytheist. I've never heard of the will. I'm sorry, we're not talking about. Yeah,
I think you're talking about him being described as. I've never heard him described as a monotheist until I started debating Christians on the topic, but they started bringing him up.
Well, yeah. So when I think of what I understand of a lot of these kind of philosophers that were, in regards to the gods, they have different opinions going all around. Like some of them were agnostic to them. I think some of them, thought of them as stories for sure, but some of them definitely had beliefs and stuff. So it's interesting to see even the various.
A quote from Socrates I want to pull out just real quick. I have altars and shrines, domestic and ancestral, and everything else that the other sort of Athenians have. I think Socrates was a polytheist too.
Could you have statues to something and just acknowledge their cultural?
He's engaging in praxis at that point in time. Atheism is like we see it today, didn't exist at that period of time. The closest you had to it was Epicureanism. Epicureanism was the idea that the gods exist, but they're not necessarily interested in human activity. Socrates didn't seem to be one of those either. But that's about as close as that you got to.
But I could definitely see that.
Atheism as we understand it now.
So again, I don't know for sure, but I could definitely see people. People go to church that don't believe in God as well.
Sure. It's just like at that period of time, we don't know anything about it. If you want to, if you have to assume and relabel the actions and the writings of the people in question. Socrates didn't write anything, but how he's quoted, you would have to relabel what's being discussed regarding him. Jesus didn't write anything either. I wouldn't call him an atheist.
Well, first off, I want to thank Jimmy for calling in and talking about the Trinity and stuff again, because it's something that we were talking about before, and it was a good little.
I appreciate it, man. I just want to say one last thing.
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it.
I study all this myself, and I don't do it from a polytheistic standpoint. I do it from a primitive standpoint. And in my understanding of how Aristotle understood the divine, I would call it panentheistic. I would use, not to be confused with pantheism.
Right.
Right. No, I know what panentheism is.
And it's something closer to that. But Paul Tillich suggested transtheism because he felt there was no, ordinary understanding of theism or atheism that reflects the God that the Greek philosophers are talking about. And so that's why panentheism was developed. But I mean, we may need a neologism. Who knows? We definitely need a better way.
There's not necessarily a contradiction between considering the one a panentheistic entity and polytheism. But I see panentheism has a really interesting history. I'll agree with you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Jimmy, thanks again for calling in. That was really awesome, and I can't wait to hear from you again.
Yeah, thank you, man.
Yeah,
see you, dude.
Cool stuff. Yeah, so that's one of those. It's funny because I love that I have different hosts every week who get to talk about the coolest stuff. And then it's just like, I just get to sit back and watch. And I just get to see how the conversation goes. Because sometimes it's just out of my field. And I love that. That's cool. I hope other people who are watching this get to learn this kind of stuff. I'm super interested now in looking into the history of the specific beliefs of Socrates and Aristotle and Plato now, and seeing their religious beliefs.
I'll send you what I was reading from. There's a guy that's as a friend of mine that is a PhD in philosophy that is also a polytheist. He's a Platonist, and he gets really frustrated with the idea of people considering Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle as being other than polytheist. It doesn't make very much sense. So I can send you some of the stuff from him. He's a really awesome dude.
There's ancient theologians who say that Plato and stuff were actually Christian and stuff.
Of course. Yeah, no, everybody wants to relabel those guys.
Yeah, for sure.
Cicero too. Cicero gets relabeled a lot as well. Cicero gets relabeled as an atheist when his text just he talks about different ontologies of deity, and but the way that he talks about defending atheism suggests that he's not an atheist, to put it that way.
Yeah. Historical revisionism happens all the time.